When it comes to planning a database, just briefly, you need to get really clear about what is the purpose of the database and write that down before you start working in Access. It's very tempting to fire up a new database in Access and just start creating your tables. The trouble is you haven't thought it through, and you really do need to think it through the larger the database. So I would seriously recommend that you grab a large piece of paper, sit down with colleagues if you have colleagues to help you, and actually map out what is the purpose of the database. By doing that, you'll actually identify main areas. So I've given you the scenario where I need to create a call tracking database, which is common to most businesses. We want to create a database that tracks who handled the call, the employees, who made the call, the customers, and what the call was about, the call itself. Now, by doing that, we've identified three main areas. We have a table, therefore, to contain employee information. We need a table, therefore, to contain customer information. And we need a table to contain call information. Now let's take the case of the employee table. Once you've outlined the purpose of your database and you've found the main areas which become your tables, you then focus on each area. So I'm focusing on the employee table and I'm thinking, what do I need to capture? They are going to become the fields in that table. So by default, we naturally give each record in a table an ID field. So because it's an employee table I'm looking at, the first field I would want is an employee ID field, which uniquely identifies each employee. In the same way as you're a number to the rates department, to the water department, to the library, to the health system, same reason that you're a number in any database. So the first field is going to be an employee ID. Then we need to think about everything else that we need to capture about the employee. Now, I would stay away from certain words that have specific meanings in Access. I'd stay away from the word name. I'd stay away from the word height or width, because these actually relate to objects in a report, perhaps the height and width of a field. So stay away from things that may have a reserved meaning. So instead of using name, I'd use full name. And in fact, instead of using name, I'd break name down into first name and last name. And the reason for that is often people will say, I need a report sorted by last name. Well, if you haven't broken full name down to first name and last name, that's quite tricky to do. But if you have actually separated first name and last name into separate fields, it's going to be easy to sort or to filter by last name. So that's the reason we break things down. Same as address, I'd actually separate town and city into a separate field so that I'm able to easily sort or filter by town and city. Later on I might decide, look, I need all those records from Tauranga, and so that's why I would like to separate that field, break your fields down. In the same way as you often see forms broken down into postcode, suburb, town and city, country, that's the same logic. The other thing I'd recommend is when you are brainstorming all the fields, so you identify all the fields you need, you stay away from sort of reserved words, you break things down so that you can easily manipulate the data, but also keep those field names short. You are allowed up to 65 or 64 characters, and I wouldn't get anywhere near that length. Otherwise you'll be doing a lot of typing when you start doing things like formulas and when you start doing things like code. So keep the field names short. Also, I and you need to decide what your style is. Every developer tends to have a style, a way that they do things, and whatever that style is fine as long as you're consistent. So for example, I don't use spaces. I don't go first space name or last space name. I make them all one word. That way I don't have to think when I'm somewhere else in the database, perhaps designing a formula, did I call it first space name or did I call it first name no space? I know me, I wouldn't have used spaces. So That's my style, and you need to find your style. It makes it a lot easier also when you do get to the point where you start writing code if you haven't put spaces and things. So I leave spaces out. Some developers will replace a space with an underscore. I find this too verbose, and we're getting back to having lengthy field names again, which is not something I like. So I keep my field names short. I remove all spaces and make them one word, and I don't use S. I will call a field note, not notes, or comment, not comments. Again, so I don't have to go back and check every time, what did I call that field? Did I call it note or notes? I just know that I don't use S's, I don't use underscore, and I don't use spaces. So just things that make it easy for you, and you're consistent as a developer. The other thing to think of is that the table is containing fields that you want populated when people do data entry. So don't include too many fields that you're not going to need. There's no point in somebody doing data entry for the sake of data entry. Every field in that table must be in that table for a reason. It's going to be used in some way. So it's a fine line trying to think of everything you're going to need, but not putting in things that you're not going to need, and it's just wasting people's time. So think about it on paper, plan it out. You can always go back and change your tables, that's not a problem. So you can suddenly think of extra fields that you thought, oh, I wish I'd put that in the table. Well, you can go and insert that into the table. The trouble is, if you think about those fields after about 200 records have been entered, you're going to have to go back and enter the data for those 200 records. So let's say, for example, you think, oh, I should have put a field on called email. So you go back to the table and you enter a field or a column called email. Trouble is, you've already put 200 people in there, so now you've got to go back and find 200 emails. So try to think about what you're going to need, what you're not going to need, as much as you humanly possibly can right from the outset to save you having to get rid of data or find data. And those are the main points with regards to planning your database.